Today we're starting this series called Generations. We're going to be talking about this the next 3 weeks. And I wanted to be clear with you guys. A lot of times when you might hear we're going to talk about generations, you may think, okay, so we're going to talk about what influenced each generation and kind of map all that out. We're not. So we did a series like that several years ago. What this one is supposed to be is just the acknowledgement that in this church, we have this really deep value of being a multi-generational church. We think that it's really important. We think that it's really beautiful. And it's also very hard. Have you ever had a time in your life where an older generation seemed to prescribe you a way of living that seemed like it was going back in time or felt outdated or impractical, or good at one point, but you didn't know what to do with it right now? I'm going to use this word prescribe a few times throughout today, just so you know. All I mean by that is they handed you a formula of this is how we did it and this is how you need to do it, and so this is the way it ought to look. This is what this ought to be like, right? Like a prescription for life, so to speak. Have you ever had an older generation prescribe to you how to parent? Some of you parents are not safe. How to discipline your kids. I always love it when I go through a store and there's two kids or a kid losing their mind and a parent who's just desperate, and then somebody else is what you need to be doing, and the person's thank you, I was looking to take lecture notes right now. That was really good, right? It's this crazy moment. Have you ever had somebody look at you and say, this is how you need to discipline, or this is how you need to work, or this is how you should be dating, or how you ought to be relating with other people. This is how it ought to be in a church and what you ought to be doing with these things. And you heard the prescription, right? You heard the thing that was prescribed, and for whatever reason, it felt yeah, that was really good at one time, or maybe that was really important or something, but it doesn't connect with me the same way now, and I don't know what to do with it. And I feel it's not bad, it's just outdated or expired or different or not matching the context and culture piece that I'm in. Maybe you identify with me in that story, but maybe you don't. Maybe you identify with my aunt. And you actually hear this and you're yes, I feel what she's saying. Have you ever felt like a younger generation is looking at the way you live and the things you value, and they're telling you it's not important? Yeah, I hear you and that's all great, but no, it's not important anymore. Do you ever feel like a younger generation is trying to give you a whole new prescription on life, for how to live your life and how to approach the world, despite the fact that you have lived longer, been through more, and overcome more things than they will ever understand, right? Than they'll even ever come to know about you. This isn't your first rodeo. It's not like you stepped out and you're I don't know what I'm doing. You've been through a few things. You've learned a few, you know some stuff. And yet they're looking at you saying, but you need a whole new prescription for your life, and you don't feel seen and you don't feel understood. For you, it may not feel like they're always giving you a new prescription as much as it feels like they're trying to take something away. And that's hard. Something's being lost. And that can be really frustrating. It's hard, isn't it? This whole idea of being multi-generational at times. It's all very real, guys. This isn't a hypothetical that I'm posing. You feel this in your families. If you don't, that's awesome. Maybe your family has figured something out, or maybe you're highly avoidant and don't talk to each other. Whatever it is, it's there, right? We have that. You feel this in your workplaces. After the last service, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and were man, I'm experiencing this in my work right now. Man, I'm experiencing this with the company that I've been in for a really long time, or the thing that I've been running, or the thing that I'm doing. You'll experience this even in your church. That's why we're talking about this here. We want to be a multi-generational church. We think this thing's really beautiful, but it's hard. Because sometimes when different generations come together, we just we're isn't that going to be great? And then we combine all that perspective and all those opinions and all that shaping into one space. And we're isn't this awesome? And we're all just going to work it out. And that gets really difficult, doesn't it? Because it can devolve into this conversation of well, here's what we ought to do. And the other one's how dare you? Here's what we ought to do. It ought to look like this. And it can really quickly become a my way versus your way, shouting across the generational divide, so to speak, much like my aunt and I on that particular Thanksgiving day, where we start arguing about these things. And eventually you either just learn to avoid the conversation altogether, or to isolate ourselves into just one generational perspective. And so we tend to surround ourselves just with people who are just like us. And that becomes a loss, because there's so much goodness and beauty in all these different generations that are brought together that God wants us to learn from, right? It's really easy, friends, to miss the beauty of what it means to love and learn from each generation, because it's hard. It's really easy to miss the power of all that perspective as we seek to make our way forward, because it's easier to find people who think and act just like us. And we can forget just how needed each generation is as God seeks to love this world forward. I think God cares deeply about this idea of being a multi-generational community. You know, Psalm 145, beginning of verse 3, it's written by David, who was a great king of Israel. He says this, "Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise." How big is God? How good is God, right? And he says, "His greatness no one person can fathom." Then he says, "One generation commends your works to another. They tell of your mighty acts. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty. And I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of your awesome works. And I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness." I wanted to start this series by just sharing this passage with you quick. Because what I think David's doing here is really profound. He acknowledges right from the beginning this idea that the glory and the goodness, right, the power of God, no one human being can fathom it. He's too big. He's too great. It's too amazing. We couldn't even begin to wrap our heads around it. And then he does something really, really interesting, doesn't he? What's he immediately begin talking about? He begins talking about the different generations, and he says one generation will speak to another, and then consequently, and because they speak of your goodness and your glory and your amazingness, I find myself praising you. I find myself saying this. The model that David's laying out here is this idea of each generation bringing their perspective to the table in a way that this one view of God that we have that isn't big enough to capture who he is just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, as if God is filling in all the colors on the color palette with each individual generation stepping in and saying, this is what God is doing. This is what I see. This is the thing that I love and respect and admire. And it starts to make the whole thing bigger. And God is as big as it gets, friends. Isn't that a gift? To be able to see parts of God and parts of how he created this world and life that you could not ordinarily see without another generation. Let me say this to an older generation, or to a younger generation. There is something absolutely beautiful and important in the way that the older generation sees God and relates to God in this life. And you don't see it. Not because you're dumb, not because you're stupid, not because you can't, because you're not them. That's all. It's because you're not them. They have something to offer you. They have something that they see to tell you about, to share with you, that will take your view of God and broaden it with all of their perspective and insight and experience in a way that's absolutely beautiful and powerful. And let me say this to the older generations. There is something beautiful in the way that the younger generation sees God and experiences who he is in this life that you don't see because you're not them. And so consequently, you need them to share these things with you and to talk about what they're seeing and what that perspective and that experience and what God is doing and shaping in them so that your view of God can keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger as each of us try to fill in and capture this thing. And in doing so, there's just more goodness and more glory. This becomes a really important thing. I think David's telling us we need one another. We actually need this notion of being a multi-generational church. It's not just an idea to aspire to. It is an absolutely essential and powerful thing. I would look and say, take one generation out of this room and we're just not a church. Not in the same way. We're missing something. There's a whole movement of what God is doing in the lives of people that we'll miss. We need you. We need each other. And what I thought I'd like to do today is just share some of those things with you, see how they're mirrored in the New Testament, and then also see a model within the New Testament for what to do with all of this now as we move forward. And so here's the first one. Every older generation comes to feel like something is being lost. This is the first one. I wish I'd known this back then. Every older generation comes to feel like something is being lost. Every younger generation wants to move forward, but comes to feel like an older generation is holding them back. This is true for every generation, always. Every younger generation wants to move forward, but will come to feel like an older generation is somehow, in some way, big or small, holding them back. Did you know that this same sense of an older generation feel like something's being lost along the way, and a younger generation feeling like someone's standing in their way, or making it harder, is like an age-old dilemma. Do you know this was one of the first issues in the early church when it got started in the first century? One of the very first things. In fact, this was one of the very first things that a church council ever got called over. The book of Acts, it's a book in your Bible. It's right after the Gospels, and it details the beginnings of the church and the leaders through this thing and all the amazing things that started to happen. and all these people come together. It's this amazing thing. Jesus does this amazing thing of starting to love and pour out grace on all kinds of people, and people are saved, and this group gathers together, and they're like, let's do this. Jesus is important. We want to love each other, love this world in a powerful way. We want people to know the truth of Jesus Christ. Let's be this movement called the church. And they all gather together, and there's an immediate tension that springs forth. And they start to argue. And they start to fight. And it all centers around something that for us is going to be really surprising because we don't really think about this. It was around the idea of circumcision of all things. Now let me explain. The old guard, right? So this isn't necessarily about generational age. There was a group of people who had been Christians for a very long time. It was historic, right? They were followers of God. They were Jewish, and their ancestors were followers of God, who were followers of God, who were followers of God. There's this long-standing, age-old tradition, and they hold on to this, and they are like this old guard within the church. And now there's also these new people called the Gentiles. Gentile just meant anyone who was non-Jewish. So for the very first time, something really exciting is happening. All these people are coming to know Jesus, and they don't know what to do with this. Now the old guard values this idea of circumcision, and here's why. Way, way, way back in the Old Testament, all the way back to the Jewish patriarch named Abraham, way back at the very beginning, right? Back in Genesis. God comes to a man named Abraham, and in ancient cultures, they believed that the gods were really far away and that you had to do all these crazy things to somehow please them or get their favor, and God does something brand new in that era, where the God of the universe reaches out to a man named Abraham and he says, I want to have a relationship with you. I want you to have a relationship with me, not me far out there. I want to be with you. I want to take you somewhere. I will be your God, you'll be my people. And this promise is between me and you, but not just me and you, your descendants forever. And in ancient cultures, when they made a promise like this, it was called a covenant. And in ancient cultures, when you made a covenant, you had a sign of that promise, right? There was some kind of seal, some kind of sign or symbol, some act that you went through, and it often involved the shedding of blood. The sign of the promise of Abraham that they would be followers of God and God would be with them, and the special kind of relationship was that every child of Israel would be circumcised. It was like a covenant symbol. It meant that you were an heir to the very promise of God. I know we would look at that and be like, that was the symbol? It was. And it was really significant. It was like an act of faith. It was permanent. It was this thing that distinguished you from other cultures and generations and essentially said, we are the people who are seeking to be known and follow God, known by God and follow him. Like there was this really powerful, really beautiful symbolism to all of this along the generation. Do you see this? I know it's weird for us, but I want you to kind of wrap your head around this. So they cared about it, and they did this for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds. Did I mention hundreds of years? So there's this long history, this really, really deep tradition around this covenant. Now, back to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 15, beginning at verse 1. And I'm going to read a chunk of scripture to you here today because I want you to see what happened. It says, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch, right? Areas within and around Israel. And were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, back in the Old Testament, you cannot be saved. Now this brought Paul and Barnabas, these were two prominent church leaders, into sharp dispute and debate with them. They're arguing. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some other believers, to go up to Jerusalem to see the apostles and the elders about this question. This forms the very first church council in church history. It is called the Jerusalem Council, again, detailed in Acts 15. The church sent them on their way. And as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. And this news made all the believers very glad. Everybody's excited about this. God's doing amazing things. Like the name of Jesus is getting spread. People are coming to know him. This is a big deal. We're super excited. That's what's happening. Verse 4, when they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders to whom they reported everything God had done through them. Then verse 5, then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. Okay, so this is what happens. Let's recap this. For the first time in history, non-Jewish people are being brought into this relationship with God in a powerful kind of number, and churches are sprouting up, and people are beginning to follow Jesus. This is a beautiful thing. And everyone's real excited about this. They're going like, yes, that's amazing. I love it when God changes lives. I love it when people come to know the truth of who Jesus Christ is. I love that forgiveness is being made known and grace is abounding and all of these amazing things. That is awesome. And then this group of Pharisees go, like that is really cool. And we're really excited about that. Like good for them. I love that this is happening, but also, like they can't just not do the things that we have been doing. But also there's this thing that is deeply important and embedded in our tradition that holds a deep kind of significance, and you can't just leave that behind. They need to do this. Why? Because it's been really significant to us for very long. This has been a symbol of our commitment to God and of God's commitment to us. This is a sign of the promise. Like, it's also this powerful act of faith. Like, this is something really big and important. Everyone needs to do this. This is important. It's how it always has been. It's how it always should be. Because every older generation comes to feel like something is being lost along the way. Meanwhile, you have these non-Jewish people who are brand new Christians. They're not the old guard. They're like this brand new group of people coming up and through this. And they were told that God loves them. They were told that Jesus died on the cross for their sins and that grace abounds and that love is real and that they're supposed to go be disciples and to go love others the same way that Christ has loved them. And they're supposed to go share this beautiful gospel with people. And this is all supposed to happen, and they're a part of a church. And they're excited about this. They embraced it. Their lives are transformed. They're going places. And then all of a sudden they hear, I know, I get it. That's awesome. But there's something else that you need to do. Now, can you imagine having that conversation, you guys? These are grown adults. Can you imagine having that particular conversation with one of these new Gentile Christians? There's something else you need to do. Yeah, that's fine, I guess. I mean, I love Jesus. This whole thing's been amazing. I love being a part of a church. What is it that I have to do? Well, you're gonna have to cut off a part of your foreskin from your reproductive area. Pause. Like, I'm gonna need you to hold it. So, like, can we just be real clear about what it was that you're specifically asking me to do right now? Yeah, I know it sounds weird. It's called circumcision. It's a sign of the promise. We've been doing this for like generation after generation, but it's really symbolic and it's significant. And here's what you do, and here's why we do this. And it's all part of Judaism. We follow the law of Moses and all this stuff. Okay, I hear you, but you also said like, I need to cut something off, and I'm a grown adult. I'm not an infant. Like, I'm gonna remember all of this, and there's no general anesthesia that's been invented yet, which means like we're all just gonna have a moment to get, like, this is a lot. I don't think that I'm ready to commit to exactly whatever endeavor it is that you're putting in front of me here. Well, I know Abraham was an adult and he committed to it, and he's a great man of faith. He's our great patriarch. So what does this mean about you? Well, you said that his yoke was easy and his burden was light, and you said nothing about minor surgery, right? Like, can you imagine the tension that would begin to brew in this particular moment? As they're like, but I'm in Christ. I'm in the church. I have the things. And you're like, yeah, but you can't just like skip all of this. You got to go back and do the same things we did because it's deeply significant and valuable. Because every younger generation comes to feel like I want to move forward, but it feels like an older generation might be holding me back. This becomes a really big deal. What is it that you think the younger generation simply doesn't get? Don't say this out loud. Don't turn to your neighbor. Some of you guys turn to start saying, don't do that. This is for you. What is it that you think is being lost? Think about that. What is it that right now, when you look at the younger generation, you think this is being lost? What is it that you think your generation did well that you don't see being done well anymore, and that bothers you? You have a hard time with that. Or think about this. What is it that you think the older generation simply doesn't understand? Just don't get it. Like, this isn't computing. What do you think would change if they let go and got out of your way? Right? Think of that question. What is it that you think your generation does well that you just don't think older generations do? And this is important, and it's needed. See, I ask you all these questions because the truth is if you're honest and you take a step back and look at your life and just think about your own thought processes and your own conversations, we think about and talk about this stuff more than what we think. Like, this is more prevalent than we think. We have these thoughts at times. You know my favorite part, by the way, about this entire conversation? My favorite part about this entire conversation is that every younger generation will one day become an older generation who experiences the exact same things, right? And the exact same sentiment and feeling. It's like a great big prank. Or we all just have amnesia and forget it and then recycle. I don't know, but it's real. What do we do? How do we live out the best of a multi-generational value when it's hard? Perhaps the golden question is this, friends, and this is the thing I want to ask us today. I don't think it has to be either or. I want to ask this question. What do you do to make space for things to move forward while also caring about what is being lost? What do you do to make space for things to move forward while also caring about what is being lost. This is the question that is of great help and value to us if we want to truly be multi-generational. This is the thing that's happening at your Thanksgiving table, or that would bless your Thanksgiving table, or your family outings, or all of the moments, right, that we find ourselves in these particular situations. The early church, I think, as they walked through this divide and this dilemma of people looking across a generational divide, so to speak, and pointing fingers at one another, saying my way versus my way, they had this counsel, and I think what they come out with was really brilliant. The way that they handle this, I want us to learn from it today. I think there's a model in it for us. Acts chapter 15, beginning at verse 19. James, who is the leader of the Jerusalem church, he gets up after the whole thing's kind of happened. He says, all right, here's what we think. He goes, it is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. You might be looking at me like, what was with the list on that last verse? It's not an accidental list. Everything that he just listed was everything that you would go and engage in and do if you were to go to a Roman temple and worship a false god. So what he's saying here, this is really brilliant. There's something really amazing that's happening here. What they're saying is, let's not make this more difficult than it has to be on the next generation. Meaning, let's not require the next generation to follow the same Mosaic law and to follow the same practice of circumcision that has been followed forever. Let's not put that on them. Let's not make it any more difficult than it has to be. And you would look and you'd be like, cool, that's the verdict. That's what's really great. But there's a second part to this. And they say, but also, verse 20, let's make sure that we hold on to the values behind those things and pass those down and mentor them into the next generation. So we might lose the prescription, we might lose the practice, we might lose exactly the rule and the methodology and the way that that happens, but let's not lose the values that anchor that whole thing. Let's write to them. Let's reach out to them. Let's mentor and lead through those values so that those pieces don't get lost along the way. Let me summarize what I think they do so brilliantly here that I think can serve for a model for us. They let the prescription change without losing the values beneath it. This is huge. I mean, this is a really, really big deal, and I hope this piece just soaks in here today. They let the prescription change without losing the values beneath it. Let me tell you why this is such a big deal. More often than not, when we find ourselves in these moments where we're a part of different generations and we start to talk, right? It devolves into but this is the way we ought to do it. No, but this is the way we ought to do it. No, but we did it this way and it's worked great forever. Yeah, but you don't know what you're talking about because the world has changed and we need to do it this way. And it just becomes a my way versus your way conversation. You feel this and you hear it like this happens. It's so easy. And what ends up happening there is we start arguing about the prescription, and then along the way, the value in the whole thing just gets lost and left behind by the wayside. And friends, some values are too important to leave behind. Some things are too good and beautiful to simply just let them fade into oblivion because we couldn't agree on a method or on a prescription. Let's hold on to what we value while letting the prescription change. What did they do? They said, we're not going to require circumcision and we're not going to make you follow exactly the Mosaic law the same way that we did it, but man, can we teach you what it is to have a loving relationship with Jesus Christ so that you don't go back into worshiping other things that leave you empty, so that you don't go back into this other stuff? That's what the sign of the promise was in the first place. It was this living, breathing reminder of who you belong to, right? Of what relationship that you had. Okay, so we won't make you do that, but let me make sure we anchor you in relationship to God so that you don't go running back in the other direction. The prescription changed, but they instilled the values. That is absolutely brilliant. Because of that, and I think that's an amazing model for us, I wanted to put a challenge before those of you that would identify perhaps in this room with being an older generation and those of you that would identify with being a younger generation. And what it means to live out this beautiful thing called being a multi-generational church together and just embracing this with our lives. And so here's this. For the older generation, my challenge is this. Mentor the values while letting the prescription change. Let me say this for the younger generation. And I phrase this weird, so I'll explain it. But it's this: embed an old value in a new prescription. Here's all I mean by that. The older generations around you, have an amazing kind of experience and insight, and they have these really deep values, and they're good and beautiful. If you sit down and you talk, you'll start to just uncover some of this and learn some of this. You don't have to do what they did. You don't have to follow the same prescription for life, but find ways to take that same value and integrate it into the thing that you are doing so that it doesn't get lost along the way, because some things are too good and important to being lost. In closing, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a moment and just look around you real quick today. Look all over the room, look behind you, look in front, make it weird, hold eye contact, do the whole thing, right? Yeah, if you're online, imagine a room full of people. Think about the last time you were in a big group like this. Okay, now I want you to think about all the people that you just looked at. I want you to think about all the perspective. Think of all the history that's here. Think of everything that has collectively been faced in this room. Think of everything that has collectively been overcome in this room. Think of every lesson that has been learned. Think of everything, piece of character that has been shaped. Think of every failure that someone has had to stare into that has given them a depth of understanding and wisdom that has deepened them and strengthened them. Think of all of the collective love that exists in this room. Think of all that Jesus Christ has been doing in and through each person in here as he has been growing and shaping and making us all, right, into exactly the individuals and people that we now are. And now think of all of that gathered and united in the grace and love of Jesus Christ in this place, and think of how absolutely powerful that could be. What is there that we could not face? What is there that we would not have wisdom to pull from, to step into? What is there that we would not have strength to come alongside and overcome? Friends, when we look at a multi-generational perspective, and when we look at this multi-generational value of being a church, it's not our weakness. It's not a hindrance. It's not a thing that we need to overcome. It is our deepest and greatest strength, because it is the story of God in each and every one of us as Christ makes himself alive, united in a powerful way. And may we never let that go. Some things are worth fighting for, and some value should never be left behind.